Welcome to the fourth video on ancient Greece. Today we are going to be examining the Archaic Greek time period and the rise of the Polis. So when we talk about Archaic Greece, we are really talking about a transition. Now, any time in history when we classify a new period, some sort of transition is taking place. Some key event is causing us to create a new time period. And in this case, this is a transition from the Dark Ages. So if you remember in the last video, we talked about the Dark Ages being a time of great poverty. There was really no ability to learn, and there was an absence of a writing system. Writing was gone from Greece. And also, people were becoming more nomadic, more spread out. There were very few villages. There were no cities, and people, if they were together, were in very small villages. Now what happens in Archaic Greece, we begin to move more towards a community setting, and that starts, of course, with the development of the Greek polis. The epic story of Western civilization really starts to get going during the Archaic time period. So let's give a brief timeline here, as I always like to do, just so you can get an idea of the dates involved. Archaic Greece occurred approximately from 800 to 500 or 480 BC, right up into the time of Leonidas and his 300 Spartans. Writing came back to Greece, as I mentioned, around 800 BC, so this was the new Greek alphabet. I will emphasize that it was a different writing system than the Mycenaean writing system. Now, the Greek polis started somewhere between 800 BC and 700 BC. Again, we don't have a firm date or year, but it probably is closer to around 800 BC. And it was developed in tandem, probably, and I use these words probably. Again, we don't have any direct evidence, but it's probably developed along with the phalanx. And we will get into the phalanx in the next video. That deserves its own video. And the first Olympic Games occurred in 776 BC. And this is pretty important from the standpoint this was not a local event. This saw several Greek city-states take part in them. And again, this represents not only the rise of the polis, but the movement more towards a community setting in mainland Greece. People are back in contact with each other, enough so that they can throw an Olympic Games and can have competitors from all around Greece. Okay, so let's move along here. So remember that the two keys to Archaic Greece are writing returns and the rise of the Greek polis. And we're going to go into both of those right now in a lot more detail. So let's start with writing first. If you remember a little bit ago, I said the key aspect of the Dark Ages is the absence of writing. And in the period before the Dark Ages, the Mycenaeans had writing. And now it's back again in Archaic Greece. So the Mycenaeans had it, the Greek Dark Ages lost it, and now it's back in the Archaic Greek world. But this is not the writing system of the Mycenaeans. It's a new alphabet, probably borrowed from the Phoenicians. Probably borrowed but expanded upon by the Greeks. And that's another point I'd like to make. We kind of like to think of the Greeks as inventing and discovering everything, but they are also the great borrowers in history. And when they borrow things, they usually improve it. Improve it so that they can make it useful for their own society. So new vowels were supplied and the alphabet is greatly improved upon. Now, the earliest writings that we have with this new Greek alphabet are found on pottery and stone. And perhaps all importantly here, the Homeric epics are for the first time written down so they no longer have to be passed down orally. Okay, so let's move on to the polis. And this is the monumental development in Greek history and Western civilization for that matter. So we need to go over a couple slides here because there's several points that I'd like to make. It's a new form of government that, as you know now, is called the polis or city-state. So, like I said before, this is a movement away from isolation in those small villages in the Greek Dark Ages to more populated cities. This is an entirely different world for the Greeks, and the polis will become the most important unit in classical Greece. We talked about the community a little bit before. And the concept of a community is very important to the Greeks. The polis will become the center of life for everything they do. So since you lived in a community, the community should be placed above everything, even for the individual. Nowhere is the placement above the individual more evident than in Sparta, which takes this concept to the highest extreme. And we'll get into the Spartans in later videos. So all of this relates to the idea of the ethos, or the Greek value system. Loyalty to the polis was considered one of the highest values a man could have living in civilized society in ancient Greece. Okay, so let's move along to the next bullet point here. It's about the people. And that is another key concept to understanding the Greek polis, is that it's not about all the stones and buildings or even temples. It's about the people. That is, the people make up the polis. An example of this is when Themistocles is arranging for the evacuation of Athens to Salamis. He is saving the city because he is taking the people with him. And he allows for the Persians to go ahead and sack the physical city. But in the end, there is always this idea that the polis will survive because the people are alive. And you can go ahead and rebuild the city, but you'll never be able to do that if the people are all dead. This is a very different idea in other empires such as Egypt, where cities are seen as the place where the king dwelled, or where all major administration functions were performed. The other point I'd like to make is this whole idea of aristocrats and noblemen versus kings. The polis was not ruled by a king, but by noblemen. And even though they are aristocrats, no one aristocrat can rule solely. Decisions are always made by ruling councils made up of aristocrats. So leadership is not determined by birth or royalty, but more by one's capability. So we can think of the polis almost as an aristocratic republic. That is, a republic run by a bunch of aristocrats. In ancient Greece, the first ideas of barbarians came about, and that related to the polis. That is, you were really not part of Greek society if you were not part of some polis. So if you were not a citizen in a polis, you were considered some kind of savage. We see some of this even today. The idea that if you live out in the country or outside cities, you are somehow backwards or seen as out of touch. So back to Greek times, if you did not live in a polis, you were not living by the rule of law. Laws can only come from inside the polis, not outside. And so the Greeks truly believed the only way to live well was to live in the polis. So you might ask, how were the polis boundaries decided? The various city-states in Greece were divided by natural boundaries such as mountains or rivers. And if that isn't available, an imaginary boundary line is drawn up. Now, I might point out that most polis disputes were usually over those imaginary boundary lines. Now, the largest polis could control an entire area around them, as we see in the case of Athens, which controlled most of Attica. In fact, Athens was thought to be around 1,000 square miles. So you might wonder, how many citizens were in these cities? Well, both Aristotle and Plato came up with kind of the same number, around 5,000 citizens in the average polis. But many are much larger. Athens, for instance, at its height had around 50,000. I should point out, when we say citizen in ancient Greece, we mean adult male citizens. So these numbers are higher if you factor in all the women and children and even slaves. So a citizen can be any man or free man that lives inside a polis. In other empires like Persia or Mesopotamia, people that live inside cities are considered the king's subjects. So that's a great contrast from the Greek citizen, who is considered free. Okay, let's talk about economics for a second. The main economic driver in the polis was farming, and that's the case in all of the ancient world for the most part. What did they grow? Well, wheat for bread, olives, and fruits were the main staples. Later on, we'll see a marketplace in many of the cities, which will increase the economic output. Now, colonization started occurring around the mid-8th century, so around the 750s. And this shows that the polis is starting to grow quite a bit. The Greeks spread from mainland Greece all the way to places as far away as Sicily and even southern Italy. So this is taking and spreading the concept of the polis all across the Mediterranean. Also, the movement back to the sea puts the Greeks back in touch with places like Egypt and Mesopotamia. And of course, these were places that the Mycenaeans centuries earlier had already established trade routes with. But during the Dark Ages, all contact had been lost. Okay, one final point I would like to make is that the polis underwent a political development or movement from several phases. Now, I also want to point out that not every city followed this model. There were some cities that did not have a tyranny. There were other ones that did. So just keep in mind this is kind of a general template. And we will talk more about this when we talk about the two main city-states in Greece, Sparta and Athens. Another point I'd like to make, this occurred over several centuries, starting in Archaic Greece and moving right down into Classical Greece. So in phase one, we see most of the cities initially with a ruling aristocracy. And like we talked about before, these were not kings necessarily. They were just ruling aristocrats. Phase two would see a tyranny. Now, tyranny in these times was not necessarily a bad guy. These actually were considered somewhat good guys. Now, some of them did have bad reputations and would be criticized, giving that kind of a bad name. But in some respects, they were actually good, and they began to check the power of the ruling aristocracy. But it was a rule by one guy, but he was not a king, and we'll get into more of this when we talk about Athens and its history. But just keep this in the back of your mind for now. Phase 3 saw democracy, the last phase, and it was Athens who actually established the first democracy, and several of the other Greek city-states would soon follow. So that was kind of the last phase where we see a direct democracy, as they call it, where people elect their own leaders, and we will talk more about that when we talk about Athens. Okay, so that's going to wrap it up for this video. I will see you guys in the next video where we will discuss the famed Greek phalanx. See you guys then.